There are men who steal money and men who steal land, and then there was a man in the West Virginia mountains who stole something far stranger and far worse. He stole the lives that other men had finished living. He did not break into houses. He waited for them to empty. He had a gift, the people of 3 counties came to say, an unnatural gift, for arriving at a man's door within days of that man's death, with papers in his hand and a sad smile on his face, ready to take over the dead man's home, his land, his place in the world, as though he had been waiting just out of sight for the owner to die. And the truly chilling thing, the thing that finally turned the county against him, was the question no one could answer for the longest time. How did Nathaniel Cross always know? Sometimes before the family knew, sometimes before the man was cold, exactly when each one of them was going to die. This is his case. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and whether the home you sit in tonight is truly your own. I ask because this is a story about ownership, about what it means for a place to belong to you, and about a man who believed that a home belongs to whoever is standing in it when the last owner stops breathing. Tell me your location. By the end, you may want to check who else knows when you'll be gone. The country was the southern coalfield mountains of West Virginia. In the years just after the Great War, a hard landscape of narrow hollows and steep farms and scattered coal camps, where the mountains pressed the homesteads into the bottoms and the bottoms were the only flat ground worth having. In 1922, this was a place of isolation and of poverty, where a family's whole worth was in its house and its few cleared acres, where the law was a county affair stretched thin across endless ridges, and where a man who died without a clear will or a present heir left behind a property that the world had not yet decided how to handle. It was in exactly that gap, the gap between a man's death and the law's slow notice of it, that Nathaniel Cross did his work. Nathaniel Cross was a man of perhaps 50, though no one could ever say for certain, and that uncertainty about his age is one of the small wrong notes that runs all through this story. He was tall and spare and very upright, with a long, clean-shaven face and dark hair that did not gray, and hands that were soft and pale and uncalloused, the hands of a man who had never worked a farm or a mine, in a county where every other man's hands were ruined by both. He dressed in dark, somber, well-kept clothes like an undertaker or a circuit lawyer, and indeed when he first appeared in a hollow, people often took him for one or the other. His eyes were a pale, light gray, almost colorless, and people who dealt with him remembered that they did not seem to blink as often as a man's eyes should. He was unfailingly polite, soft-spoken, and patient, and he always arrived at a time of death. He came into the southern counties around 1915, the records suggest, and at first his activities seemed merely opportunistic, even useful. A man would die, an old widower, a bachelor farmer, a family man with no nearby kin, and within days, sometimes within a single day, Nathaniel Cross would appear at the property with documents in hand, a deed of sale signed by the deceased, a note of debt the dead man had owed him, a power of attorney, a contract of purchase. The papers were always in order. They were always signed, always witnessed, always dated before the death. And on the strength of them, Nathaniel Cross would quietly, lawfully, take possession of the dead man's home and land and move in, and the county, having no closer claimant and no reason to doubt the papers, would let him. He did this once, then twice, then again and again, until by 1922 he owned or occupied better than a dozen properties scattered across 3 counties, every single one of them the former home of a person who had recently died. Every single one acquired with papers that no one could prove false. For years, this was merely thought clever and a little cold and not anyone's business. The first sign that it was something worse came in the winter of 1921, and it came from a young deputy named Asa Liller. Asa Liller was 26, new to the office, and he had the dangerous habit of noticing patterns that his older colleagues had trained themselves to ignore. He kept a personal notebook of his cases that survives in a West Virginia archive, and in it he recorded the thing that first snagged his attention. He had been called to a hollow where an old farmer named Greer had died alone in his cabin. And when he arrived to see to the body, Nathaniel Cross was already there, already in the cabin, already going through the dead man's papers, with a deed of sale in his pocket dated 3 weeks earlier. And Asa Liller noted in his book a detail that no one else had thought to record across all the years and all the properties. The old farmer Greer had been dead, by the look of him, no more than a day. But Nathaniel Cross had arrived at a cabin a half-day's hard travel up a hollow that no one had passed in or out of for a week, in deep winter on the very morning of the discovery. He had not been sent for. No one had carried word out, because no one had known. And yet there he was, with his papers, as though he had simply known to come. That is the first sign. Not a buzzard circling a known carcass, but a man arriving at a death that no living person had yet had time to learn of. Asa Liller began, quietly, to look, and the pattern he uncovered over that winter is the escalation, and it climbs in a way that turns the stomach. He went back through every property Nathaniel Cross had acquired, every death, and he laid them side by side, and he found 3 things that should not all have been true at once. First, that in case after case, Nathaniel Cross had arrived at the property impossibly fast, faster than word of the death could have traveled, sometimes arriving, witnesses now recalled, before the death rather than after it, sitting in a wagon at the foot of a hollow the day before its old owner died, waiting, as one frightened woman put it, like he had an appointment. Second, that the deaths themselves, though each had passed as natural at the time, formed an unnatural cluster around this one man. Old people and lone people and the occasional whole family, dying quietly, in their sleep, of failures of the heart, of fevers, of nothing anyone could point to, always conveniently, always leaving an empty house that Nathaniel Cross was already holding papers for. And third, the detail that finally broke the case open. The papers. Asa Liller compared the signatures of the dead men on Nathaniel Cross's deeds against other documents the same men had signed in life, and they matched perfectly, too perfectly, every loop and slant identical, which is not how a man's signature behaves across the years. And several of the deeds were signed and dated by men on days when those men, the deputy proved from other records, had been miles away or already too sick to hold a pen. Nathaniel Cross was not buying homes from the dying. He was producing flawless deeds, signed by men who had never signed them, dated to before deaths that he somehow knew were coming. He was forging the past to claim the future. But forgery, however uncanny, is a human crime, and Asa Liller might have closed the case as a clever fraud if he had not, in the spring of 1922, gone up to the property where Nathaniel Cross actually lived, the first home the man had taken, years before, the seat of all his holdings, and found the thing that no fraud explains. This is the re-hook, and it is where the case stops being about papers. The deputy went up alone, with a warrant, while Nathaniel Cross was away in the county town. The house was an ordinary mountain farmhouse, well-kept, silent, and in a back room, locked, Asa Liller found Nathaniel Cross's true records, and they were not deeds. They were a ledger, a great thick ledger, and in it, in Nathaniel Cross's own precise hand, was written the name of every person whose home he had taken, and beside each name 2 dates. One was the date of death, and the other date, written first, written in advance, was a date that Asa Liller realized with mounting horror was always a few days before the death, the date he came to understand, on which Nathaniel Cross had decided that person would die. The ledger was not a record of deaths that had happened, It was a schedule of deaths to come, and there were names in it, near the end, with their first date already written and their second date still blank, the homes of living people that Nathaniel Cross had already decided to take, with the days of their deaths already chosen and set down, waiting only to be fulfilled. And one of the names with a blank second date Asa Liller saw was his own. What Nathaniel Cross was, the deputy never fully learned, because by the time he came down off that mountain with the ledger, Nathaniel Cross had vanished. The man returned to the county town, was warned somehow that the deputy had gone to his house, and simply left, abandoning every property and every paper, and was never seen in those 3 counties again. But Asa Liller did learn the shape of the thing, from the ledger and from one old woman in a far hollow who had refused, years before, to let Nathaniel Cross take her dying brother's home, and who had lived, and who told the deputy what she believed. She said Nathaniel Cross did not find the dying, he chose them. She said he was not a man who profited from death, but a thing that fed on it, that took somehow the home a person had made, the life they had built, the place they had become in the world, the way a lesser scavenger might take the flesh. The deeds, she said, were not how he stole the homes, they were how he made the stealing lawful afterward, a cover for a hunger that had nothing to do with land. She said the reason he always knew when a man would die was that he was the reason the man would die. That to write a name and a date in his ledger was to seal that person's fate, and that he had been doing it for far longer than the few years the county knew of. That her own grandmother had spoken of a tall, pale man in dark clothes who came to take the homes of the dead, with papers and a sad smile and eyes that did not blink. Back before the war between the states, looking, the grandmother had said, exactly as he looked now. Nathaniel Cross was never caught, never tried, never explained. The dozen properties he had taken were returned. Where heirs could be found and where none could be, they were left empty, because the county people would not live in a house that Nathaniel Cross had taken, believing, as they came to believe, that to occupy a home he had marked was to put your own name and date in some ledger you would never see. Asa Liller survived, his own blank date never filled, and lived a long life and kept the ledger, and would say of the case only that there are men who steal what you have, and there are men who steal what you are, and that Nathaniel Cross was the second kind, and that somewhere he is almost certainly still going, hollow to hollow and county to county, century to century, arriving with his papers and his sad smile a few days after he has decided that you will die. Today, the homes Nathaniel Cross took stand empty, or stood empty long enough that most have fallen, scattered across the southern West Virginia mountains, marked on no map and avoided by the local people, who will tell you that a cross house brings death to whoever sleeps in it. And every so often the old people of those counties say, an old widower will die alone in a far hollow quietly, in his sleep, of nothing in particular, and a tall pale stranger in dark, somber clothes will appear at the property within a day, before any word could have traveled, with papers in his hand, dated before the death, and a sad and patient smile, and pale gray eyes that do not blink as often as a man's eyes should. And the wise families of those counties, when an old one of theirs goes, make very sure to get to the house first, and to fill it with the living, and to leave no empty home and no open question for a stranger to answer with papers. So, what was Nathaniel Cross? Was he a brilliant, monstrous con man? A forger of uncanny skill who studied the isolated and the dying, predicted their ends from their age and infirmity, and arrived with flawless papers to strip their estates? A human predator whose only true crime was greed and patience, dressed up by frightened mountain people into a thing that chooses the day you die? Or was he what the old woman believed, something far older than any one man, a creature that fed on the lives men built rather than the bodies they lived in, that marked its prey in a ledger and so sealed their deaths? and that has been moving through these mountains for longer than the records run, and is moving still. Was the chilling thing about Nathaniel Cross his crime, or his calendar? Asa Liller saw his own name in that ledger, with the date of his death already chosen, and he carried that knowledge for the rest of a long life, and he never could decide whether he had been spared by a con man's flight, or by something far stranger losing interest. Most who hear the case cannot decide either. This is one of the most unsettling cases these mountains ever produced, and if the old people are right, the man with the papers is still out there, still arriving, still choosing dates. So tell me where you stand. Do you believe Nathaniel Cross was a human forger and predator, clever enough to seem supernatural? Or do you believe he was something that feeds on the lives men make, that writes your death before it comes, and that may still be working these hollows today? And if you found your own name in a stranger's ledger with the date already written, what would you do? Tell me below. If this story crept into you and you want to go deeper into the strangers these mountains let in and the homes they were too frightened to keep, then stay with me and subscribe, because there are more empty houses in these hills than there are people to explain them. Until next time, when one of your own passes, get to the house first and fill it with the living, and leave no empty home for a stranger to claim with papers and a sad, patient smile.